It's amazing to think that it's 5 years, almost to the day since the charity was founded. An idea we had back in around sort of 2010. Vanessa Venables, for those of you who don't know her, she's a speech and language therapist, and we worked together at the Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead. And the inspiration for the charity was really because, as a surgeon, I had this idea that, you can do operations to help patients with facial palsy, and you can get some results, which are often good, sometimes average. But I realized that it was only the tip of the iceberg. There were many, many more patients then that could be helped through surgery, who could be helped in a wider way, either psychologically, socially. For many children who have facial palsy, they'd never had any kind of contact with anybody else who was affected in the same way. And also we had this increasing pressure that we were getting from GPs and from the funders about, was this surgery just cosmetic? Was it worthwhile? Would they continue to fund it? And so in discussion with actually we met Karen, who had her own website helping patients and supporting around facial palsy, that she did in her own time. And through discussions we recognised that if we could try to aggregate all the concerns of patients, we could try to put forward a common idea and theme to try and provide both information, because the information at the time was very, very scanty, very unreliable. We could provide support through support groups, and also help to try to fund some research. Vanessa, come on in. This is Vanessa, I'm actually the founder of the charity. So that was the idea we hatched, and eventually so we did a survey just to make sure that we weren't going to sort of reinvent the wheel. Obviously there's lots of charities out there. Changing Faces is the most well-known one, which helps a lot of patients with a wide range of appearance-related issues and concerns. But it was quite clear that even though there were charities that related to some of the conditions that cause facial palsy is quite specific. It causes, obviously, as you know, some specific physical issues, some functional issues, and also some social issues as well. Regardless of the cause, be it a tumour, be it an accident, be it from birth, there are some commonalities that could be helped with one unifying charity. At the time when we first started the clinic, the interval between the onset of facial paralysis and presenting to the clinic was almost 6 years. We had patients who were sometimes 20 years that had a facial paralysis and had withdrawn away from life, perhaps changed jobs, given up work, etc. And that was clearly a bit of a disgrace. We found that we had patients travelling from a long way across the country to see us, which was also inconvenient for them, and we wanted to see whether we could, again, find out where these patients were and try to put together a way of allowing access at a more local institution. Information quality, as I mentioned before, was very, very scanty or poor. Patients were sometimes being advised to do exercises and procedures that were actually counterproductive in many cases. And also there were very few community resources as well. So in 2011, we met with a number of people, stakeholders who were interested in being forward in this, and we're glad to see some of the people at those initial meetings that are here, like Wendy. We finalised our objectives around those three themes of information, support, and research, and the charity was finally registered in 2012. Let's say almost 5 years to the day. And had an initial launch meeting at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in London. So here are the main aims of the charity, as I mentioned. Raising awareness, because even GPs very often are unaware about facial palsy. Patients are often told that they were mistaken for a stroke, therefore mismanaged. They were unaware that this isn't a cosmetic issue, this is one that impacts one of the most foundational aspects of our interactions with people through facial expressions, and therefore causes psychological issues. Obviously the emotional and physical effects are very clear in terms of speech, eating, drinking, and also to make sure that we could try and to improve the quality of care through promoting better diagnosis, better management, and better rehabilitation. So when we first started, in year one, 380 patients were supported, and Karen's been working tirelessly. Our only really full-time employee we have, Lorraine, who works also in the charity as well. It's been incredibly hard work for her and all the volunteers who've been helping. Year 5, 580 people helped, a 53% increase. This is directly anyway. Obviously many more people helped indirectly. The website has been a really, really important source of information because obviously a lot of people live a long way away, and we have people accessing our services via the internet across the country and actually abroad as well. That first year there were 18,000 unique visitors. These are unique individual visits, not individuals repeatedly visiting the site, but specific individuals. And in this last year, over 250,000 people accessing the Facial Palsy UK website. The site has, within this last year, been overhauled, and it's much easier to use. It is now responsive. You can use it on the mobile phone much better. We have a huge library of information, videos, etc. And in this coming year, which Karen will talk about, we're going to be increasing that further to improve the information and knowledge for health professionals as well. So that's over 1,000% increase in this last 5 years. Social media is obviously a very important way of communicating our aims and our ambitions, and in the first year we had 500 followers in our social media campaign. 5 years on, that's increased to 3,000. Again, a 500% increase almost. We have a newsletter which we send out monthly via email to people, and in that first year that's increased from 142 people to over 1,000 people. Again, huge increase over the last 5 years. And as most of you know, the charity, we really rely on our volunteers, both the medical, therapy and patient members. Obviously most of our fundraising comes from volunteer activities, cake sales, sponsored activities, cycle rides, runs, marathons, etc. And that's been incredibly powerful. We have now 61, between 5 and 61 volunteers every year. I can see some of our great marathon runners in the audience here who've done great things in terms of raising funds for us. The support groups are really, really important because we know that whilst us as professionals can help to some extent, there's a lot that we don't know about what it's like to live with facial paralysis, and recognising that empowering people through peer support, people who've been through that journey before, helping each other, is a really important way of helping people to interact and move forward. And the support groups are really, really key, and we started out with just the one at East Grinstead all those years ago. We now have between 5 and 10 running around the country, which I'll show you later on. Sorry, up to 61 participants attending. And here we have it now. So initially we had just the one support service at the East Grinstead Hospital down there on the bottom right, between London and Brighton. And now we have support group meetings running across the country. We registered in Scotland and now also in Northern Ireland as well. And our aim is to try to make sure that people really aren't more than an hour's journey to their local support group. You see, it's a very important thing. We're also obviously running the family days as well, which again, about trying to increase the access for both parents with children with facial paralysis and the children themselves and teenagers to be able to meet someone with the condition and perhaps develop connections that can go on forward between those sessions. I'd say that as a surgeon, bizarrely, helping to establish and run this charity has been the most fulfilling and most impactful thing I've done. Forget about operations, where you can help perhaps one person at a time. I've been really privileged to work with some incredibly hard-working people, volunteers, and fellow trustees. We'll talk about it a little bit more later on. So that's the first 5 years. I'll hand over to Karen now. In fact, first of all, to Vanessa actually, to give a bit more of a background to us. Thank you.
Hi everybody. I'm not going to spend too long talking, but I just want to, I've enjoyed having a think about the last 5 years and the support groups specifically. And as Charles said, the first support groups were set up at Queen Victoria Hospital. Now that was a little while before we actually got the website up and running and before we got the charity launched. So there was a huge amount to understand from people living with facial palsy and their families what this unmet need was. So those early support groups at Queen Victoria Hospital for me were an unknown quantity. And interestingly, in the very early days, because as Charles said in the earlier part of the presentation, some people were waiting over 6 years to get a referral for a specialist service. So actually, when the people got together, one of the biggest things that they were addressing was their unhappiness, not about their condition, but about the management in terms of where services were, where they could get both physical, practical, and psychological help. And there was just not enough information on the ground for clinicians or for people living with facial palsy. So this was a very powerful thing that was happening at the meetings. People were angry, but actually it wasn't a negative anger, because it meant they could channel that anger into doing something about it. And that's how they supported the charity. So when you think about the website and the launch, what that required was the effort of people living with facial palsy and their families to actually galvanize themselves and support the charity, because that was going to be the only way forward. And so now I think what happens in our support groups, we don't hear the anger so much about how difficult it was to access services, and that has to be because of the amount of word that spread, the website, 250,000 people accessing it in the last year. So the word is getting out. So indirectly, we are helping an awful lot more people than those figures suggest. And really, the last support group that I ran at Queen Victoria Hospital was so very different to the earlier ones that we ran, still very vibrant, but what people were doing at this last support group was just supporting each other about what it was like living with that condition. So we had kind of been able to shrug off our anger, our disappointment, our negative feelings, and over the last couple of years it's been about supporting each other informally. It's always got a positive end to it. The groups are very fluid, so you'll not get the same people attending each time. So each time we meet, it's a very, very different feeling. So different things are happening. So one meeting might sort of revolve around a new member that's interested in what it's like to have reanimation surgery. So we'll have people there who've been through that process, and they're able to tap into all sorts of advice to prepare them for the procedure. Other things that happen are relatives come, carers come, and that feeds back into the charity, because the families then want to do the fundraising. And we've been so desperately dependent on individual fundraising activities to keep us afloat. It's only in the last few years, 2 or 3 years, that we've got more funding packages from independent funders. So if we hadn't had the support groups, we wouldn't have been able to galvanise the families, the friends, and stay afloat and continue. There have been points where we have thought, are we going to be able to survive? And every single penny that people have raised for the charity, starting off with the support groups, has been absolutely vital. So it's so good to be able to stand here today and to thank everybody that's here and those that aren't here, because it has been a very much a two-way process. It's the people living with their facial palsy, and it's all those volunteers. It's the hard work of people like Karen, Mr. Nduka, possibly a little bit to do with me maybe. But so it's tremendously satisfying to stand here and talk about our 5-year history. So thank you very, very much.